So George.
Here we are.
George Young.
That's me.
Okay. Do you want to talk about the first time you met Phil? And I don't know if you remember any first impressions you had of him.
Well, I think Phil and I could never quite identify where we first met. We know about when, and we were both sales reps. He was working for what was then called a College Outline series, which was actually published by Barnes & Noble at that point, way back in the dawn of time. And I was working for a distributor which employed me as one of the specialists that sell paperback books. And I was selling Ballantine books at the time and Berkeley books. And I didn't ever get to actually sell this book, Hobbit, which may be something that people recognize. But anyway, that's Ballantine books as it was before. That's after. The beginning of Ballantine was kind of back in the early days of paperback publishing. And anyway, I was, I went to the same stores that he went to talk to about books and bookstores and other kinds of places. And we do remember running into each other right around the early 60s. And we couldn't pinpoint where or exactly when, but we know that was about the period. And then we ran into each other from time to time because we were going to some of the same places, and we ended up at the same industry gatherings. So we got to know each other a little bit. And as time went by, I guess, our careers all went on, and we both, it was one thing that we shared is, sort of the idea that when we talked about it, we said, can you believe this? Somebody's actually paying us to be with books all the time. I would pay them to let me be with books all the time, and they don't have to know that. And both of us felt that way. He had grown up in neighbors. A guy was a book collector, and he taught him a lot about books as a young child, and really. And he'd grown up with a kind of fascination with books, liked to find out different things about them, chase them down, and so on. And I had kind of started as a reader and just moved on from there to saying, wow. And so we kind of both ended up doing something that you'd have to drag us kicking and screaming away from doing it, because it was just, sort of was in our blood, and it was not a hard thing to keep doing. And so that was early mid 60s. I had at that, I guess, maybe I met him. I had kind of quit working for a magazine wholesaler and went to work on the other side of the magazine wholesaling shop, which was a distributor of trade paperback books. And so I did that while I had this crazy idea that I'd go back to school and get a degree in international relations, become a diplomat, travel the world. And then I started realizing, no, you're going to be stamping passports up some river somewhere in the Congo, and that's not really what you want to do. So I came back into publishing, and that landed me pretty much into a different part of the world, which was Macmillan Publishing and hardcover books and stuff like that. And I thought, this is nice. But all the time along there, I had kept as contact with this publisher of Ballantine books. His name is Ian Ballantine, and he and his wife had founded Ballantine Books in the early 50s, but they'd also started a paperback business in this country because they imported the first Penguin books to the United States in 1937. Phil, of course, got his first job with Penguin Books. So, all the cross lines just kept building up, and the thing that happened was that I worked for other publishers, but I ended up being a scout for Ballantine. Sort of not really paid, but the hope was eventually I could switch over to that, and that was through the mid '60s, and I was involved in. Ian made a contact with David Brower from the Sierra Club, and that started him down the trail of doing environmental books, and I got to work on a lot of the Sierra Club books because I was here, and they did a whole series of books with David Brower, very, very beautiful illustrated books. Anyway, all this is prior to the change in everybody's life. About then I had been, I guess, about it was about 2 years after leaving this business, I thought, going back to school and coming out of school with a degree in international relations, which did me no good at all. But I went to work with Valentine as a scout, and then his chief editor left. At the same time, almost the same time, within 3 months, the head of Penguin USA left Penguin. So I moved to New York. Phil moved to Baltimore, and he was basically in effect de facto head of Penguin USA. But he hated it, and I didn't exactly hate it. No, I loved being at Valentine. But anyway, I was overnight. I went from being book scout out in the trenches to being editor-in-chief of a major paperback house, and I thought, terrific. What did I do to deserve this? Mm-hmm. And so at that point, we kept in touch since we were the two outlanders in the Eastern publishing scene, because neither of us were. We were both native Californians, and we started saying, how did we end up here? People asked us that question all the time. But anyway, we did get together a few times in New York. And then Phil decided to bail out of the Baltimore thing. He stationed himself back in California for a while. And when he did that, he went into a bookstore in Santa Cruz. And oddly enough, it was started by the guy whose job I took at Macmillan. This all crossed paths in so many ways. And anyway, he went into this store and was sort of rummaging around. He was kind of looking for books for Penguin too. And one of the clerks told him, Phil, you really ought to catch this book that we've been selling a lot of, this homemade book here on 10-speed bicycles. It's called Anybody's Bike Book. Mm. And it was really crude. It was this kind of level of illustration. And it was just sort of a down-home way to go out and this is what you need in the way of tools to go. I mean, it's a really elemental book on how to fix 10-speed bike. This was at the beginning of the 10-speed bicycle boom that was just about to happen in the early 70s. And so he was there at the beginning, and he had the book that everybody wanted. Well, next stop, several 100,000 copies were sold, and he had a publishing company. He never expected that. He expected he'd do a few more bicycle books, thus the name 10-Speed Press, which, we invented various ways of explaining the origin story, where did that name come from? Well, let's see, what story shall we tell this time?
So he intended to quit after just some bicycle books?
Well, he intended just to do bicycle books. He never thought he'd be able to do anything else. And then a friend of his had a lawyer friend who had a friend at the counseling department at the University of California in Berkeley who said, these students, they need some help, and we've been using this book that was written by an Episcopal minister, and it's called What Color's Your Parachute? And we don't know where that title came from, but it really is pretty popular with the students, and the counselors all think it's solid information. And so he looked that one up and looked the man up, and they saw each other, met. The guy self-published it. Yeah. And it turned out the guy's name was Dick Bolles, and What Color's Your Parachute went on to sell 10 million copies. So all these years later, this was what the first edition of What Color's Your Parachute looks like. This is what the 2020 edition looks like. A little bit different.
Still got the same parachute on it, though.
Still got that same parachute because it's kind of like a lucky charm or a totem or anything. You don't really want to mess with it.
Yeah,
with
yeah. Where did
what
that come
got you
from?
here.
It looks like, where did that come from?
It was all part of the original. The original design was done by the author himself with a small designer in San Francisco who really, literally did this on her kitchen table by hand with paste spot in. Was all the primitive tools of design. But what she did was simply get a Dover book and get things like that out of it.
Yeah,
and that's where
the
it came
clip art.
from. And when you look at this closely, that's not a parachute. it's a balloon. And so you say, okay, this is one of the many contradictions that'll be ahead. So we just live with it. But anyway, so Phil started, had those two things, and then along came somebody who's had a cookbook from a small restaurant in Ithaca, New York, and had, by way, again, a bookseller recommended it to one of our sales rep. Our sales rep sent it in and said, maybe this would work. And they looked at it and found that it was a vegetarian cookbook that seemed to have some style to it, and it was all hand lettered and done and everything like that. And actually, Mollie Katzen, who's the author, took it to a publisher in New York, and I think it was Doubleday. It was Doubleday, and the editor she found there was a very senior editor who said, "Look, everybody here will want to tell you how to do this book, and I think it's great the way it is. It's hand lettered. They'll tell you, no, you got to typeset it, and it's got your illustrations, and they'd say, no, you don't want to do that because they're sort of primitive illustrations. They don't really, She said, well, I was never an art major, and she, so this is the newest edition of Moosewood, which, this is what seemed to capture people again. And you're talking the early 70s when people were beginning to think about, things differently, and they were thinking about vegetarian stuff. The vegetarian food is something you take seriously. And anyway, this book captured a lot of people, and it proceeded to, just like Parachute and Anybody's Bike Book, proceeded to sell its little head off. And so Phil ended up a couple of years later, around 1975 or 76 or something like that. He had 3 books that averaged over 25,000 copies a year. That's unheard of.
Yeah.
I mean, a big publisher doesn't have that. And he was just in a small apartment on up by the campus and right across the street from Sather Gate, actually. And
the
so
UC Berkeley campus?
The
UC Berkeley campus?
Yeah, UC Berkeley campus, and it was, the Sather Gate was where all the free speech movement started and all that stuff. It's the rallying point for most things at UC, and it's right at the entrance to the southern part of the campus. And anyway, so he was sitting there with books stacked in the cabinets, stacked in the tub. I remember Dick Bolles telling me that the first time he found a copy of Parachute at Phil's, he had to go dig it out. That stock was in the bathroom in the tub. And so Phil was about ready to change all that and say.
So he was working out of his apartment.
He was partly working out of his apartment. But he was doing his promotional stuff out of the apartment. Because he knew how to sell books. He didn't really pride himself on being an editorial genius or anything like that. And he had a good eye for a book that would sell, but he didn't kid himself beyond that. And so about this point, this was 74, 75. Ballantine Books was acquired by Random House, and as they wanted that to become their premier. They didn't have a mass market line at the time, and they wanted to turn this into a mass market line and of some significance. And I was not really their first choice for an editor anymore, and so I pretty much was gone, and so were Ian and Betty Ballantine and most of the rest of the crew. And so I had one option. I heard about a job out here, and I thought, well, let me just take a look at that. And I came out here and talked with the owner of the publishing company called Celestial Arts in Millbrae, and we made an agreement that we tried for 90 days. If it worked, I'd stay. If not, I'd go back to my family in New Jersey. And so what happened was about 50 days in, and I talked to Phil, I think, sometime when I'm back here, and he said, you know, I'm just, I'm overwhelmed by the amount of stuff I have to get done for stuff around here. And we talked a little bit, and I said, well, I don't have that problem. I'm just trying to hang on. And a friend of mine called from publisher in New York. He said, I've got management here talking about wanting somebody, the description they want in the way of a paperback editor. He said, it's you. He said, it just fits you to a T. And so my family and I had to stop and look. Do we want to grow up our kids, who were about 7 or 8, 6 to 8, somewhere in there, and or do we want to come back to California? And we voted for back to California because I thought, looks like a publishing scene's growing here. I might as well roll the dice with everybody else and see what happens. So we moved back, and I took the job at Celestial Arts, and about 3 or 4 months after I got there, the guy that was actually the day-to-day manager of the place quit, or was fired, one or the other. And the owner said, okay, you're the only person around here with any experience. Will you run this place for me? And I said, yeah. But what about our 90-day deal? He said, it's done with. Let's just say you're here. You're hired. I said, okay. And so we started from there. And so that started down the trail of, you know, Phil was in Berkeley. I was in the peninsula in San Francisco. And we, I think, bumped into each other at shows again and other events, and in the business, you know, a lot more obviously here instead of in New Jersey, where I was able to see him once in a while. And I came to understand why the guy quit, because I couldn't get along with the owner either. And so basically, again, either I quit here, he fired me, I'm not sure which. But I decided, okay, I'm enough. I'm skilled enough at this thing. I'm just going to hang my shingle out as a freelancer and see what happens. And Phil heard about it, and he called me. He said, why don't you come over and we can talk? And so I went over to Berkeley, and this is about 1977, 76. Yeah, it was 76. And
was he still in his apartment, or did he have an office?
No, he actually had an office.
Did he have employees, or
he had an office. He owned this building up on Solano Avenue with 2 partners. So he had. I remember walking into the place. You know, sort of. It's an apartment house. The offices were in 3 apartments. And there was a kitchen, sort of, and a restroom or 2, and that was it. It was not an office building. It was not wired as an office building. It was just sort of improvised like everything else. And I walked in. I think there were 6 people, and you know, at that point, his sales were a couple $1 million. We figured out at one point, you know, our Apple sales per employee were higher. Our sales per employee were higher than Apple's. But we didn't have that many employees. That was the only secret to that whole game. But you know, pretty much Phil said, look, you know, I really need somebody with your experience. Mine is not the same as yours. And he said, I never really got interested in running a company. You know how to put this thing together seriously. And so he said, why don't you come over once in a while and help me do this? So I did. And you know, I sort of set up the editorial and the production and the art and design, all the different parts of the company that should be. I said, you know, you really need this stuff. And he said, I know you find good freelancers, you can get some of that work done, but you really are not able to organize it as a publisher unless you have them, sort of. And so that's what we set about building for the next couple of years. And so that was the period from the mid-70s, 77 to 79, 80, 81, somewhere in there. And then I looked up one day, and I hear I was a freelance person. I thought I was working for three or four. I figured I could work for 4 to 5 publishers. But I woke up one day and I said, wait a minute, I'm not working for anybody but 10 speed. I said, Phil, I think I work here. He said, well, you're around all the time. So basically that's how we came to an agreement that I would join the company and be here for a while. So that was in the early 80s, or the late 70s, one or the other, I'm not sure which. But anyway, so from there on in, it was still a fairly small enterprise, and it was still kind of pretty much seat of the pants management. And even though he thought I had a lot of experience, I didn't have experience in all the different parts of it. Neither one of us was that good at finance, except we knew if we brought in more money than we sent out, we would be in good shape. And what we knew about was that, the Bay Area was the seed of a lot of small publishing, and that was exploding around the country. It was part, the 70s, the 60s. This generational thing was spilling over into, literature, and suddenly the whole Earth catalog happened, and the book looked like a different thing. It wasn't a piece of furniture; it was a real tool, and we were there with the kind of books that helped people because they were how-to books, and so you had Moosewood Cookbook, and you had Anybody's Spike Book, and then a small religious community north of Petaluma had started they were a religious community, and they created a legendary vegetarian book. It was called Laurel's Kitchen, and the way we got involved with that was we were at a conference, the American Booksellers Association, and our booth was right across from theirs, or about one down and over. And she was, Laurel Robertson, who was the Laurel of Laurel's Kitchen, was doing what she does. She had these great oatmeal cookies that she was passing out to people who, made at least 3 trips a day to refuel. But I was right there, and so I was there very often during the course of the day, and I got to know Laurel.
Yeah.
And she said, I'm really tired. Random House was distributing them at that point. She said, I'm so tired with us dealing with everything, trying to get the press to run properly, and I want to work on a couple other books. So they were printing their own books? So I'd like to work with somebody close by. So that's how we got to publish Laurel's Kitchen. So one morning we woke up and we had 2 of the 3 best vegetarian cookbooks on the planet. And, intentional, planned out, very deeply thought out, all those mechanisms that everybody tells you about, this is how you do it. Not a piece of that was in this, It was just, somebody telling a sales rep about one and sending it to the publisher, and me being across from the best source of oatmeal cookies was the other. And so it's not exactly the literary tale of the year, but anyway, so that was really, at that point we're in the business that we just sort of came up with the simple concept that you just look at the society around you and see where the interests are, and a whole Earth catalog was a roadmap to what was coming, and these funny little things on a desktop with a lot of keyboards on them and the screen there and that stuff. Those people were all around us. We were in the middle of it here, and we sort of just got to doing the things that we thought were, of interest as we looked at all the different sources of this culture, and just sort of say, well, they're going to want to have a different lifestyle, and there are parts to that involve vegetarian cooking, and there are parts of it that go beyond that, and then there's the whole reality that you have to find a way to get along in life. So what color's your parachute? Suddenly started introducing people the idea that you may have more than one career in your life. In fact, you may have a few, and in fact these days you probably have 5 or 6. and you really have to know what your skills are, and you really have to know how to work on it. And so we were sitting there with, a collection of things that really kind of caught people. And early on we had decided, or I proposed to Phil that, he said, we could really probably stop right now and just get along on these books and probably have really make all the money we would possibly need to run this company. And we could run it with just a, very small imprint and just, find a few more and just keep it low key. Or we could sort of see if we can find some more interesting stuff to add to these. And what's going on out there, we think we have a pretty good feel for it, so maybe we could find some more stuff. So we kind of talked about it a bit, and we kind of landed on the concept of, we're going to be able to be good at just a few things, so why don't we get really good at them? And so one of them became careers, obviously. We went to the things that we had done that put us here. We went to careers, when we went to, cooking, and we looked at anybody's bike book, how to, and we thought, what else? And we realized we both had an appreciation for a certain kind of sick humor that, was also part of the scene, and we thought, okay, there isn't enough humor around in the world. Let's see if we can make. So those are the kind of strands that were really formed the early shape of the company, and it was food and fun, and we tried not to get too carried away with trying to come up with a long-range plan or anything like that, and we tried to say, let's just look for good books that we know we can sell and that fit in with what we're doing. And because our background was in sales, and we were pretty good acquiring editors, but we're not, line editors by any means. And so we said, let's just use the instincts that we use to find books that we think appeal to this audience we know is out there now, and we identified them pretty well. So
what are some examples of the humor? You were talking about the humor line. How did that?
Well, that kind of started the book. I didn't shock Phil, but I surprised him. I found a book in the British magazine called How to Have Sex in Public Without Being Noticed, and I thought, this book is going to get us in trouble wherever it goes. So let's just get it and see what happens. And he thought it was a great idea. I mean, one thing that Phil brought to the party throughout the company's history was that he really had a kind of nerve to go ahead with something against all the advice you could possibly get, against all the sensible ideas that people had about doing this stuff. And he just said, fine, looks good to me, let's go. And so that's what we did. We found that, and then we found a couple other books. And a couple of years later, I found a book called The Solar Cat Book, which kind of actually was written by a really good young architect. And it predicted what we're going now, solar farms, everything like that. This was, 1984 or 85 or something like that. But he was using cats, he said, who knows more about sunshine than cats, So he kind of took that simple concept and kind of ran out this thing, the solar farms and all these energy sources, So what you have to do is understand the cat's mechanism and imitate it. And so, so that's kind of where the humor side came. And the humor side, kind of was the high point of the humor, I think, of all the years we did things. I mean, I got a thing called the Original Roadkill Cookbook, which is, again, I think we headed for things, if possible, that would offend or outrage a lot of people, or at least surprise the hell out of them. And so that came up. But the book that really crystallized our humor world was this kind of parody from an Australian called Why Cats Paint. And there's just hundreds of tales to tell of this thing. But the crazy thing that Phil was able to do, because he was owner of the building that we were in, there was this corner store that went out of business. And he said, well, let's turn that into a gallery so we can put the cat artist painters' paints down there. And I said, what cat artists? what paintings? He said, well, we can find some. He got the guy in Australia to send a few, and he said, we'd have to do them first. He said, well, okay, well, we'll wait, but get them here soon. And what he did was go to the SPCA and got a couple of nice-looking Siamese cats and really rather elegant cage, and we put these paintings up around the pile of the books and in the gallery downstairs, and that kind of, it was unbelievably against all the things they tell you how to promote anything and in any book about that, and it was seat of the pants stuff, and it was an option that we had because Phil's property was there. Mm-hmm. And all, you know, what he did was spend time in the gallery, you know, making contact with people, and guess what? Once in a while, a guy showed up with a microphone, and somebody else showed up with a notepad, and a cameraman, and suddenly we said, "What's that truck out there with all that funny gear on it?" And there's a bunch of guys out there who speak French. It's a French television channel, which had heard about this gallery in California for cat painters. And so, and Phil just rose to the occasion because he had a procession of people who were talking about their cat. Mm. Their cat. They weren't sure. It wasn't really clear that they might have the talent, but they might. And, you know, well, you were around Phil long enough to know that you give him an opening like that and he'll drive a truck through it.
Yeah.
And so he would stand there and say, one thing I have to tell you, they don't like to be watched while they work. So you have to step back. You can't be near the cage. And they were in this cage right in the middle of the gallery, and then he'd step the person back and he talked about it. Does your cat ever, you know, move their food around onto the floor? You know, you look for signs of artistic talent, and, you know, just total BS from the word go. And he would just, the more the person bought in, the more he would just pour it on. And anyway, so we went on to, I don't know how many 100,000 books White Cat's paint has sold, but yeah. it is a landmark on the Tensby Trail. And
now there's a black cat sculpture in the office that we don't exactly know where it came from, but some people said it was possibly in the gallery.
It's possible. It's
okay.
possible. Phil, I'll have to ask Jack Ledger. He'll know.
Okay.
If there's a black cat sculpture.
Yeah, it's the big. He did
look around for some stuff that were things he could pass off as being done by cat artists who were to remain anonymous, of course, because they have their.
Did he actually sell the art?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Even he wouldn't go that far. But he would say, I can't. I would not know how to compensate them. I mean, he thought that was kind of over the line. Even for him, that was over the line.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't go there. But anyway, that was the high point of our humor. But in beneath all the things that somehow we had a lucky kind of what used to be called karma, but something was with us, because if you stop and look at White Cat's paint and look at it closely, read the text, look at how it's laid out, it is a parody of art books and the art world in general. It's not just a funny book about cats. Mm-hmm. It's a really clever book about art and what we do with it and how we respond to it, and that's beneath that. That's the layer people discover later. Mostly they start off with, oh my gosh, look at that. Do you think no. Our little cat couldn't do that, could it? And so anyway, again, we got really lucky. A couple of years later, we were at a conference for career counselors, and one of the people with us, Joanne Deck, went out to lunch, and she saw this book being sold at the counter of this gift store, it was the only copy, and it had a chain which attached it to the cash register, and that person that ran the store wouldn't let it out of her sight. And so she asked her about it and said, well, anyway. That led us to our next book that was thought to be humor, but it actually is a sociological treat. And white trash cooking sort of came along at another juncture, and again, it was a very clever, really clever presentation of Southern life. Anyway, white trash cooking, again, we had no reason to think that again, no grand plan, go out and find a book of parodies, yet another thing, and yet presents a pretty even-handed. I came across something when I was looking in one of the old catalogs that talked about the number of Southern writers had spoken about the book, and there was Harper Lee. She loved it.
Wow.
She thought it was the most interesting sociological study of the South that she'd ever seen. Harper Lee, who knew? So we thought, okay, we have to really, not just trust the process and let it go. And so in another corner of the field, these couple of vegetarian cookbooks we had kind of led to, Phil liked to go to a nice meal. He really did, and he had done it all along. We went to, when we saw each other on the road from time to time, he would only look for the best restaurant in town. He would not look for the closest or cheapest. And in any case, we kind of got into the business of looking around at cookbooks, and he sort of encouraged that, and he became friends with a few of the chefs that were, again, there was in the early 70s, there was a movement of young chefs who were saying, we've had all the classical training like that, we could possibly stand. And in many cases, they were architects in training. They were engineers. They were French teachers. They were not chefs in the classical sense. They were trained. They learned on the job in many cases more. But anyway, they came around. And one of them was a fellow named Mark Miller, who opened a restaurant here on 4th Street and in Berkeley, and did very well. Moved up to a second thing on an old Santa Fe train terminal, called it Santa Fe Bar and Grill, and decided that he really wanted to go to Santa Fe and do the dream he'd always had, to put together a restaurant that really represented all the things he loved about Southwestern cooking. And he was one of the people that helped define it. And so we knew Mark very well. Anyway, we signed the book, and we thought, okay, now what? Because we can't just do any kind of book. And I said, well, let's go at it a different way. So I sent a couple of designers down. Instead, I didn't send an editor down to work with him. I sent a designer down, and they took pictures of everything that he was doing to make this restaurant. And that's when we got Coyote Cafe together. And it's all based on the colors and the mood and the feeling of the thing. It's just odd little features that are in the book, that are art that he had collected. They were all characteristics of the restaurant that people could see and feel, and it imitated the colors and the style of the restaurant. And that was kind of the breakthrough idea.
Yeah, that's different.
People hadn't thought of looking at a restaurant, but this new breed of young chefs, they kind of knew what they wanted. Cindy Paulson over in San Francisco's Fog City Diner, that showed up 5 minutes later, and again, we didn't have to do it for her. She knew what she wanted to do, and again, it was a representation not just of the food, but of the style behind the food, the thought of the concept of the restaurant. And so, that's, I think, pretty much, again, it wasn't planned. It just sort of emerged out of the sensibilities that we saw operating and how we could fit in with them as a publisher. And that led to all kinds of wonderful things coming. Again, the kind of seminal book when we sort of said, well, we're really kind of getting this right. We did several other cookbooks. We continue to follow this idea of paying attention to the sensibilities of the person who was creating the book and trying to replicate what made them feel like they were presenting their food in a context that they liked. And somewhere along the line, a sales rep had bumped into somebody who was an agent, who was an art agent, and who had discovered that there was this museum, well, not a museum, an art book publisher had gotten tied up with a very famous restaurateur in Chicago, and he wanted out. He said, I don't want to be told how to do a book. I want to do the book I want to do. And, well, our name came up, and the artist representative called me, and we made a deal. And then, so I got to go in and tell Phil that we were going to do books like this. And there's only one thing, and at the time, what gave me courage was there was a series of books on European food that were being done by a publisher who was talking the food of Rome, the food of this, the food of that, and they were $45. And I said, Phil, we're going to do something in this art book format, and we're going to do it with the highest standards of production we can possibly find, and embellish every part of it with the best we can do, and the chef is so interested in it having exactly the way he wants it to be. He's going to do all the design, and he's going to do all the work on the photography and the presentation, and our designers will get in there and kind of straighten things out and make it possible to print it. And but the only problem is that's going to make it a $50 book, and people didn't do $50 cookbooks then. That was, again, we're up into the 80s, into the 90s now, late 80s and early 90s, and so Charlie Trotter's was, if you went to Charlie Trotter on four people at Charlie Trotter's could really have a really wonderful dinner and probably get out of there with, only a $700 or $800 bill, including wine. And it was a very, very high-end restaurant, and it was absolutely the right idea, which would no way belong in the same shelf as the high vegetarian cookbooks that we had been doing and stuff like that. But again, this was a second along the way. Now I don't know how many,
But this was
30,
one of the
40,
first.
50 books.
Yeah.
But these were the motherships to
Yeah.
the concepts that, were really, taken seriously around here and in a lot of other places, because if you look at the style of cookbooks and when they all kind of changed and swung this direction in one point in the early 90s, it was mostly because of these books. These books kind of pushed everybody over to look at what they were doing, how they were doing it,
Right.
and listening to the chefs that they were working with. Because what the chefs were saying, well, they do it, why don't I just go talk to them? And we were, at that point, we had an embarrassment of riches. An awful lot of really good people were coming to us, and we didn't always have a way to do their books. And anyway, and we weren't the only one. There were a couple. Again, the publishers who perceived all of this, there's a book being worked on now by a university library press about the early 70s in independent publishing, and not the fine small press publishing of literary worlds, but the kind of publishers that were like us, the Workman Press, the Running Press, the Chronicle books. We were doing different kinds of books for a different generation and a different view of the world, and it shifted the style of the way things were done in a lot of places. And anyway, there were people in any way taking these ideas and reshaping them in a lot of different ways. and we were just lucky to have been along for the ride. And meanwhile, over on the how-to side of it,
Yeah.
I was kind of taking care of that, and keeping my eye on what counted there, and we sort of tried to find the books that would work with the kinds of people that were interested in having something to do with the way where they lived was shaped, and like, you know, build it yourself, fix it up yourself, make it work the way you want it to work. And there was a group in Berkeley called the Owner Builder Center, and they were intensely interested in teaching people the right ways to do building, not just, you know, get a couple of boards, try and get them together. And no, you learn how to do this right. Here's the tools you use. Here's how you do it. You have no room for error here. And they had workbooks that went with all this, and why don't we do those? So I approached them, and we got them to sign up a couple of books with us called how to building your own house, basically is what the main book was called. And there was another book that it was really their kind of model for getting people to think about the process. It was called Before You Build. And it really was saying, you know, sit down, think about this. This is what you're going to be up against. You know, this is how much money it's going to cost you. This is the kind of standards you're going to have. You know, if you don't do what we say about building it yourself, this will still help you if you know what you're doing and you know what you're asking somebody to do. Even if you don't do it yourself, you will know more than you started with. So, again, a totally different style of book. Again, not the rules that everybody, you know, very, very important. Serious how-to publishers have been trying to do books in this arena for a while, but they wasn't doing it. And there were, at the same time, we weren't unique because there was a publisher who did a book called Nomadic Furniture. It was all built on this concept of, you know, hey, you're going to move around. We saw that going on. I saw another book come by, and I thought, wait a minute, we could do that too. And so I went after the designer of that book. It was called A Movable Nest. And it went on the supposition that, again, parachute. I was drawing on our lessons from parachute. We're going to live a different way, you know, so why have furniture that's going to weigh 300 pounds per square inch? You know, you're going to be up and moving every few years. Live with that. Make it the way you want it. Right. And Nomadic Furniture led me to this movable nest, and you know, we had a little luck with that thing. It wasn't really the right book. Somebody came up with a couple of things like that. But off in the corner, there were other books like that being done, and showing people that, you know, you could really kind of make it all yourself. I mean, fast forward to the current scene. I mean, most recently we've seen people, you know, being the tiny house. You know, there's a kind of a movable tiny house. People living not because they have to live in a RV, but wanting to live on the road, or needing to live on the road because they were working in such a way that they were transient workers, and they needed to do that. And anyway, so this whole movement is still with us, and it's taking different form, and my suspicion is a lot of it will inform our current housing crisis when you know, when people stop and think that we could do more than build overpriced condos, and maybe we can learn from what we've already learned.
Yeah. So you were talking the other day about some of the sort of advertising that 10 Speed did that was sort of unusual. Because our background was in selling books, we kind of had a couple of ideas about that, and the core idea was one we carried out over and over again. I think I've got one of the catalogs here that I can dig out in a minute. Yeah. Well, we'll go back to what we decided to do was when we did a catalog. Traditionally, publishers have only done books in seasons, month by month,
and you did a seasonal catalog which said these are the new books for the season. You don't do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we and the other small publishers I described said, hey, we have more than those books. Why don't we put the whole thing in there? We put all our books in a catalog. We put them in groups that were together, so that, you know,
there's
we thought,
the Solar Cat.
There's Solar Cat.
Yeah.
And again, we thought the person who was interested in careers or cooking or whatever, we get them on the page with one, then let's make it more than one. Mm-hmm. The next page and the page after that. And incidentally, this book here is a book about making your own instruments by a guy by the name of John Scoville.
Oh.
Who has
his name sounds familiar.
Yeah, he went to University of California, Santa Cruz for one thing.
Ah.
And he's the guy that recommended Bill do Anybody's Spike book.
Ah.
He was working in the bookstore.
Aha.
So all this turns in a very small radius.
Yes.
And anyway, so we were from the very beginning always going to present the books in groups, not in singular books, and not only just the new books we're doing, but all the books we do. And that kind of led us to, you know, the further development is full color catalogs, which you know, were a good way to present the books that we were doing. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of moved on to that, and then at the core I felt always that we had a unique kind of presence in the business. We were not ordinary. We're not like, and so I thought we had to build on that. And I actually waited almost 7 or 8 years to use the one line I wanted to use, and it came that I got an opportunity when we first did White Trash Cooking to do something with that. And our industry publication is called Publishers Weekly. It's out every week, and they sell big ads in there for a lot of money, but sometimes they get a cancellation and there's an open space. There was a back cover on Publishers Weekly in a special issue, and it was right about the time we got White Trash Cooking. So what again I had wanted to do, I always prided us on trying to make people, you know, sort of have the feeling, I don't know what they're going to be up to next, but I want to know about it. So we got that back cover, I put this on it, and all I did, 10-Speed Press, who else? Gutsy move. I had no idea how gutsy it was until everybody said, did you really do that? Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good idea, but maybe I'm not sure anymore, but it was the basis of the way we did things was we wanted people to be on that edge of saying, you know, they're the only ones who would have done something like that. And, you know, so the White Trash Cooking, the Coyote Cafe, even What Color's Your Parachute. And then we got up to a friend of mine came along, he's an agent, and he said, you know, I've tried to sell this book all over New York and everybody loves it, but they won't buy it. I said, good, you've seen 20 publishers in New York who won't sell the book, but you know, you come to me then after you've seen 20 publishers, huh? And he said, yeah. He said, well, it was kind of a problem. Everybody loved the writing and loved the book and thought it was a really great concept, but they wanted to change it and the author wouldn't do that, and it was wrong. And I said, okay, what is the book? He said, well, it's kind of an outdoors book. And I said, yeah, tell me more. And so he said, well, it's kind of an outdoors book that, you know, some people might find difficult. He said, so we were trying to find the right title for it, and you know, it just couldn't quite come down to a simple statement. So I said, look, what do you want to call it? Well, everybody wants to call it When Nature Calls, but the author's not happy with that. And I said, well, what does she want to call it? She said she wants to call it What It's About, How to Shit in the Woods. And I said, oh my God, yes. Yes, it's our duty and our obligation as a publisher to perform public outrage whenever possible, and we have to do that book. And I knew that Phil would jump on in a second, and he did. And again, because of that ability he had to go all in on something that a lot of other people would say, oh no, okay, oh my God, I think I might be, all things that would be wrong with doing that were things that he would respond to as real opportunity. And so we had a sort of a brilliant inspiration somewhere along the line. We were trying to think of other ways to promote the book, and we kept people saying, you know, you're not going to be able to sell it with that word on it. And we kept saying, well, we don't know about that, because we've had park rangers call in it. And if there's anybody we were afraid of not wanting the book anywhere around, it was park rangers. We thought, oh my God, government property, ranger, oh no, you know, pure as the driven snow. They're not gonna allow this book in. They were the people who were first in line. And they and so we said, let's honor the other people. So we did a separate edition called How to Blank in the Woods. And this never got over 3,000 copies. This is probably close to 1 million copies, How to Shit in the Woods. So with the word. And so, and one of the high points, the author was about, what, 6'1"?
Oh, I didn't know that.
She was a river guide and took people into the back countries and stuff like that. Really tough. Good writer, but, you know, learned the outdoors firsthand. And could tell people about it. And you know, but she was hauled by the Japanese Toilet Association to a conference. They paid her all the way to Tokyo, and so she said, I can't believe that I'm going to be addressing the Japanese Toilet Association. Anyway, so that went through many changes and many things, but again, we were able to present this problem of, we'd explain this to a lot of journalists. Well, we tried this, and then we tried this. This didn't work. And they loved it. They were off writing that article before they left the room. Yeah. And
so you guys had a good reputation.
So we had, and again, we had one more notch on the what are they going to do next?
Right.
So and when we did Coyote Cafe, what happened with it was delayed 3 or 4 times because Mark couldn't. He was opening the restaurant. He had a lot of things going on. He couldn't really quite get used to doing a book on a schedule. And so we kept announcing it, and finally a couple of years later we get the book, and again I had one of these open pages, and I put it on the back cover of Publishers Weekly, and put one word: finally. Now I'm sure that there were only a few hundred people in the country who got that idea, but I know they got it, and I know they were what we now call influencers. I mean, people in the food world or people in the book world would know what I was talking about. And I figured, okay, if I just have a lot of them chattering, that's going to help this book, it's going to help us. And again, one more, who else would do that? And that is always what we tried to do, is to get that edge on things. And it goes through the White Cat's Pain, it goes through the How to Shit in the Woods, it goes through all kinds of other things. And it just paid off. Mm-hmm. It paid off to have that kind of attitude, and somewhere in the mid '80s, we acquired Celestial Arts, the company I formerly worked for. I had the pleasure of.
Were you instrumental in bringing them in?
Not instrumental in bringing them in. I'm instrumental in getting it done. But one of the things we learned about was that that was not a simple task to take on another publisher and become a different publisher when you had things that were not. And oddly enough, they were kind of a new age publisher. They were spiritually oriented and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't seem
like a good match. How did you guys decide?
It's stuff that we would never do.
Yeah. So
we did stuff they would never do. In fact, they were kind of. Are you really going to do that? A couple of times, and we sort of used that as a test if that worked. That's probably a good idea, at least by our definition. But they came along, and we had the problem that a lot of growing companies had. We had a lot of success, and we just had to find a way to keep that going. And so we built our own reputation as much as we could. But here we had another company, and we didn't really I had helped run it. I knew something about it. I was pretty conversant with a lot of New Age stuff because of publishing that I'd done in New York and here. And I was able to say, I think we can fly this one, and there's a good person there. If we get him to come along, we'll be able to hold our heads up and you know, stay out of the rough water. And as it turned out, we did. But the thing I discovered after they were aboard for a while, we didn't understand what happens when you are building a company by adding something that you didn't create. You know, if you're expanding stuff that you did yourself, it's one ballgame. When you're saying this is somebody else's job, and we're going to have to kind of make that happen a different way. And for one thing, there were different kinds of customers. There were people that wouldn't buy any of these books that would buy their books, and vice versa. And I sort of felt, okay, we've got to get this ballgame going a different way. And plus, which I was sort of feeling, as we're growing, and we suddenly have 30 people around the place instead of 5 or 6.
So are you still on Solano, or have you moved now to Harrison? No, I was going to say,
this is about where we moved, in addition to everything. Well, no, actually, we were on 2 floors in Solano.
Okay.
And so we had 20, 30 people stuffed into a place that shouldn't have had more than 10. And there were 2 floors of 2 old storefronts that we converted to offices, and an upstairs set of apartments, which we converted to offices. And we later then moved down to this part of the world that way.
Was it to the one on Harrison?
On Harrison.
On Harrison off of Gilman? Okay.
Yeah, and that was the old North Face headquarters building came available, and Phil had always admired it as a building and wanted to be there. And
it was an unusual building.
Yeah, they didn't sort of. Again, they were kind of seat of the pants too. They kind of developed the whole North Face thing like Patagonia and other things. I mean, that was the entrepreneurial spirit at the time.
Yeah.
You sort of did what you thought was the right thing for the customers you thought were out there, and kind of worked out.
Yeah. I remember the whole time I worked there, the logos, the North Face logos were the door handles.
Yes.
The big door handles that you enter 10-speed were like giant North Face logos. And I was always like, why is that?
Why is
but
that?
It was
That's
because,
why. Yeah. That's why. And the interior is this open, expansive piece of territory. You say, why would anybody, you don't do an office that way. Well, that's their world. You open up, you climb, and you have an open. We had an atrium kind of thing.
Yeah.
The windows, I mean, the roof slid back and stuff like that. Anyway, so we had.
And you had raccoons, families of raccoons nesting
that was later in the development.
Outside your window.
But what I was trying to do is, we were in the middle of all this kind of growing, and with different people and movement and stuff like that, I thought we've got to do something different here. And so I thought we need to have a communications that everybody can share. So I thought, let's do a newsletter. So I thought, what do you mean, let's us do a newsletter? Yeah, you do a newsletter. So I started doing a newsletter every week.
Oh.
And it was called, and I thought, I'm going to direct it to the salespeople, and everybody else can read it, but it's sort of a way to share information around the place without, and again, no rah-rah speech, no anything like that. I thought that's the last thing. I'd sat through enough boring sales meetings to say, it's the last thing you want to do to anybody. And so I thought up a title for it. It's called Verbal Abuse. And so every Friday morning, whatever rain or shine, I would sit down and do the newsletter. And it wasn't really about what we were doing all the time. It wasn't a sales pitch. It was just about the world around us that was changing. I tried to describe it to people as we were moving through it, and how we fit into it, and why it wasn't unusual that this kind of book was working or that. But it wasn't all about business. It wasn't all about that. And I found that all kinds of people in the building sort of started looking at it, and Phil read it avidly every week. And I said, there's only one way you can test a newsletter. Stop it. So we stopped it for a couple of weeks, and everybody, where's my, I didn't get my paper this morning. And I thought, good.
Good.
Again, my test was to say if anybody missed it, then they were paying attention, and that's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went on and I did that newsletter every Friday for about 8 months of the year, not the whole year. I picked a season when we start selling books in the spring through the season we were selling books in the fall. And I didn't, when the busy times, or the times when people are, having fun, I didn't want to bother with them.
Yeah.
So it didn't run for the year. And I ran all the sales numbers through it. And it was later I learned kind of a transparent management scheme, because I basically let people know how books were selling. It's the actual numbers there. Hey, no bullshit here. These are the numbers. This is what you think this is the best book? No, this is the best book in terms of numbers. And I get the important information into the thing, but it was always a joke. And I had, at the time, there was a newspaper around, kind of a kind of an early version of The Onion. Mm-hmm. And it was called Funny Times, but they were very visual. They did a lot of cartoonists, and I literally stole a cartoon and pasted it up every issue, and I try to give credit to them and the artists, but I didn't always manage it, and so we again trained to make it not the ordinary, but try mm-hmm. to find a way to unify this growing organization mm-hmm. in some way that would be fun. Yeah. And so that was the whole object. And what I didn't realize till many months or years later was a bookseller would say, "Are you the guy that did that verbal abuse?" I said, "How did you get a copy of verbal abuse?" "Oh, the salesman always gave it to me." And I didn't realize that, yes, of course, somewhere out there, a few salespeople had
passed it on,
made copies of it and passed them around, mm-hmm. and somehow people knew of that. And again, it's one other level of people finding out this odd little company had this odd little publication that didn't really make sense to be sending out every week, but there it is, mm-hmm. and it's interesting. And so it was just more of the fabric kind of mm-hmm. woven in a different way, and no one of these things were really that well thought out, whether it started with this kind of design was not cleverly thought up. It was a way to get it through a certain size press with the limits of color. We couldn't do 4 color, we could only do 2.
Right,
so
right.
we sort of figured out, and we want to be able to mail it easily. We want people to be able to mm-hmm. tuck it in a bag, mm-hmm, and mm-hmm. so like everything else, it was just sort of, let's make it interesting, but let's not lose sight.
Yeah.
And so the whole advertising thing went to that. And one of the things we did in trying to present things to people was try to get more elaborate ways of presenting what we did as groups of books. When our cookbook world was really emerging, I came up with the idea of doing a cookbook catalog, which was only devoted to cookbooks. Mm. And we called it, my brilliant idea was call it Ingredients for Great Cooking. Everybody said, that's kind of a mouthful. And we just call it Ingredients? I said, yeah. And so for years it was Ingredients. But I took that theme, and there was a magazine around called The Gourmet Retailer, which was the internal the industry magazine for this kind of new food store that was mm-hmm. opening around the world. There was. It's hard to think that there weren't places that could sell you a $200 knife and a set of pots and pans that you could finance at any local bank. That it just was forming, mm-hmm. And so the magazine that went to that, I just ran a small columnar ad every issue, and it was called Ingredients for Great Cooking. Mm. And it all kind of tied together because we needed a tool to talk to those people in their language, not ours, because we were booksellers and they were not interested. Books were, somebody taught me this a long time ago. It was actually a fellow who was a pioneer in the natural foods world. And he said, you know, and I kept this in my head. It sort of, Phil and I talked about this a couple of times. He had this idea. He said, you know, the health food, quote unquote, store, which we now call the natural food, which we now call Whole Foods. You know, he said, you know, they don't have books because they want them. They have books because they help them sell the pills. That's the way he looked at it. You know, the health food store was full of vitamin pills, and they wanted a book that's going to say, you should have vitamins all the time. Here's the ones to get. And, you know, he sort of saw that, and I saw it, you know, when it came to the gourmet market that was developing, it was kind of the same exchange. They wanted cookbooks. Yes, it's nice to have, and yes, they are helpful. And that was before cookbooks were as stylish as they are now. But even now, you go into a properly appointed gourmet shop, and books are not the major item in there. The pots and pans come way before books.
Right.
And so, you know, I thought, again, if the same rationale, you know, it was good to be in front of them all the time. And so the catalog and the ad in their publication all the time is saying, you know, we're here, we're helpful. And don't try and convince them to be booksellers.
Yeah.
Let them sell what they sell, and let them also carry books that you can help them, and remind them that, hey, cookbooks help you sell the other gear, you know?
Yeah.
So
Lorena Jones, who of course is a fantastic cookbook editor and is now our editor-in-chief, she was saying that you are the one that hired her.
Yes.
And lured her away from Texas. Do you remember that? It
wasn't hard to lure her.
Yeah.
she was halfway lured, but she reminded me of that the other day, and I kind of remember the conversation now we had. We had this strange conversation. What I didn't know was that she was in this heat wave in Texas, and the only way she could, and she was also in the offices, very small, conservative, traditional publisher she worked for in Texas, and so the way she figured out how to call me was to go out in her car, turn it on, the air conditioner, and call me, and she had to speak softly because, anyways, so the couple of times we talked, she talked once from the office and once in the car, and we just talked about that the other day, and it just, she was kind of coping with the only way she could do the call, and I at the time I couldn't figure out what's going on, why the call was this strange, and she was whispering and stuff like that. But
are there other memorable employees who sort of shaped 10-Speed that you remember working
with?
Sure,
yeah. There's Joanne Deck was hired as a credit manager and ended up being, you know, the source of a couple of books like White Trash Cooking, brought it in. There was there were a number of editors that came along for a while that helped out bringing things, but for most of the early years it was strictly Phil and I that acquired most of the books. And then when we acquired Celestial Arts, one of the reasons I want to acquire them is a fellow named David Hines, who then went on to be the publisher of Celestial Arts, and so he was certainly one of the influences. And
I never met him, but people talk very highly about him.
Oh yeah. He was unfortunately died very young from Parkinson's, and you know, really was very helpful, and not just he put Celestial Arts on a firm ground, but also helped a lot with everything else, and was very instrumental in getting a lot of things going. And we had no formal sales structure, because the unfortunate thing to having two people who came out of sales in management of the place, you know, it's very hard to get a sales manager who was strong enough to hold up against that. And so tended to have people we call sales managers, but they really were something else. They were much more marketing people, and so we spent way too many years probably with independent reps when we probably should have hired our own sales force, and we should have had a strong sales manager there. But that wasn't the way it developed for us. And the other memorable people, and along the way there were a lot of editors who came through, and the really, in most cases, I'd say they break down 2 or 3 ways. Their idea of publishing was not what we do. It was a literary life, and they didn't stick around long because they thought, I'm never going to do the great poet, the great novelist here. I got to get on.
Right.
And then we had people who showed up and stayed a while because they had some idea that maybe they'll straighten this out and do things the way it's supposed to be done, and that was an unfortunate attitude because it didn't ever work, and the contribution of so many people that came through here, they're really like Lorena. Everybody kind of worked here and worked their way into the job they should be in, and that was kind of the way. That was kind of Phil's style, We'll find out soon enough how good you are at this and how much you want to do this by letting you do it. And that was kind of the thing that the other day when I was, I sort of said what I felt the other day when we had a group of people here, and for the retirement party, I sort of said, I just feel so lucky. I walked into something I love to do at age 21. I didn't have a chance, I just loved it, and I was going to stay at it no matter what. And it kind of hits the mark on what people tell you is true. Do what you love, the money will follow. And the money never quite followed for me, but we're working on that one. But anyway, so yeah, there was I ended up saying, my way of looking at it is, if people thank me for doing something, I thank everybody else for letting me play, because I feel like this has been a playground for a lot of years, and I just feel like I've been lucky enough to be around for it, and being able to take the toys home.
Yeah, well, that's a great sentiment, and of course we are very lucky to have you be part of 10-Speed and help make what it is today. Yeah. So you're one of the people I think we're lucky to have had around for a few years, so there we go. Mutual Admiration Society, but it's real. It's real. So one final question, I don't know if you know the answer or not. One final question is, do you happen to know the story behind the sheep? The sheep were all over the office.
Oh, God.
In the old office. They've moved with us to the new office.
Yeah.
Everybody who sees the sheep says, what is with the sheep?
The sheep was an answer to a peculiar situation. We had a tradition of going to the big bookseller show every year, of having a kind of a funky booth. I mean, one of the things we did was paint a giant backdrop, which ended up being the cover of our catalog. This was one of a 30-foot long canvas painted by a couple of people who did all the Tower book in San Francisco. The Tower Records. Tower Records. Their big signs. They painted this kind of half block long thing for us. And we used to take it's in sections. We could take sections of it. It was a big bookstore, and we had that for years, just hanging in as canvas. And we had various other things that we did, but they were all kind of informal. And then suddenly we thought we ought to be a grown-up publisher, and so we had and Phil's brother-in-law was an architect, and said, I will give you a really good workable design that you can use for years, and it will be stylish and present things the way you want it to do. And so we got this really grand edifice of, steel here, glowing things there, lights there. We sort of said, this needs something. And so we had one kind of leftover tool that we had used before. We had neon signs that said, the 10-speed logo was one neon sign, the other one was Celestial Arts logo. And, they didn't do enough, so we sort of took, actually, the architect's daughter was sent out to find something that would put some character into the thing that wasn't, modern and stylish and everything. And she was out looking around, and, I don't know whether it was in a gallery or in just a show place. She saw these kind of odd sculptures, and she stopped to look at them. And it turned out this guy had built on these wooden frames. He covered it with a sheepskin, and rebuilt a sheep on a wooden frame. And so she thought this was a good idea, and she bought them.
Ah.
and Phil loved it. We brought the sheep to the first conference, and we had this great new sort of multi-booth setup with all the lights and everything the right way. Everybody walked away talking about the sheep. What the hell is sheep doing in there? Well, they wandered in one day, and we just couldn't let them go.
Was that the story you told?
Yeah. Oh no. That again, the opening of a line like that. Where did they come from? He's going to drive a truck through it. So.
Right. And
so the sheep were actually, their original purpose was to kind of liven up a nice booth, but just not quite us. And he made the right choice in sending his niece out to do it.
Oh, good.
So,
okay.
Yeah, there's the story.